This is Red Eyes Creations Radio coming to you from the west coast of Sweden. My name is Henrik Palmgren and I want to thank you for tuning in to the program. Our website is redeyescreations.com. We are growing every day. I want to thank everyone for your kind emails. We read all of it and we'll do our best to reply to as much of it as we can. So stay tuned to our website, of course, if you want to follow along in our news, listen to our radio program, watch some of our live webcasts, or see some of our video interviews or short films, or listen to some of the extended radio programs that we have up there for you. Today we have author Peter Russell with us on the line. His most recent book is From Science to God, a physicist's journey into the mystery of consciousness. And Peter is also a lecturer. He's given talks and written extensively on what I guess we can say is the mystery of consciousness and connecting the metaphysical to the physical. His website is simply peterrussell.com, where he has articles, videos, and books available for you. So I want to thank you very much for coming on the program, Peter. Nice to have you here.
It's nice to be with you. Thank you.
So why don't we begin, talk a little bit about your background and some of the work, that you've been doing over the years to build, I guess, a little bit of an image for our listeners, Peter.
Yes. Well, I mean, as the subtitle of my book suggests, it says a physicist. I started off being very interested in physics and mathematics, probably because I was very good at it as a child, and you go to university and you study what you're good at. And I still love physics, but there came a time in my study of physics where I realized it wasn't really answering some of the deep fundamental questions I had, which was basically, why is there consciousness in the universe? I mean, according to modern physics, the whole thing just should be unfolding by the laws of physics, and we can explain from that how chemistry evolved and biochemistry and how animals came into being. But why should any creature have an internal experience? I mean, I am, listening to you now, I'm talking, all of that is a mechanical process. Why do we have this inner subjective experience? In a sense, you could say, why is there mind? We can understand everything about matter, but why is there mind in the universe? And we know there's mind for absolute certainty, because I know I have my mind, I have my thoughts, I have my feelings, I imagine things. Why does that happen? And I realized physics was never, ever going to answer that question. And so I started becoming interested initially in psychology. I thought studying the brain would help, but I realized all that did was just allow me to understand the brain much better, but still there's this question, why is there mind? Why is there consciousness? Mm. And I think that's really the mystery of consciousness, and a lot of my life has been around exploring that question. And also, how do we awaken consciousness? How do we become more conscious? Because in my journey, I ended up going to India and living in India for a while, because I felt the people there, the various yogis, spiritual teachers in India, knew a lot more about consciousness than we in the West did. And what became very clear for me there was that we are, in a sense, half awake in our consciousness. We are, we have awareness, but so much of the time we are just functioning in our conditioned way. We're not really thinking for ourselves. We're not really aware why we're doing things. And so it became clear that one of the most important things was how do we wake up and become more conscious? Because I think so many of the problems that we see in the world today stem from the fact that we're living in a very limited, egocentric, short-term level of consciousness, and that clearly has to change. So really, a lot of my life and my writings and talks are around this question of how do we become more conscious? What's that about?
Right.
That's the sort of brief survey of my life.
Yes. So maybe we can begin to talk a little bit about consciousness before we can move on and talk about how we can become more of it, so to speak, then. And how would you, if I would ask you to, I guess, define or try to, circle a little bit around consciousness in order to explain it better for us, what would you say?
Yes, I think circling around is a good idea, because it's actually very difficult to define. You can go to an English dictionary and you can find, several different levels of consciousness, different meanings. We talk about we're conscious when we're awake, and yet, we say we're unconscious when we're asleep. And yet, if you think about it, when you're asleep, you have dreams. Dreams are experiences. They're happening in the mind. So there's some awareness. It's just we're not aware of the outside world, and often we're not aware that we're dreaming. But there's still awareness, or you wouldn't be dreaming. And so even when we're asleep, there is consciousness in that sense. So I'm talking about consciousness as the fact we are aware. It is what is always there, whatever we're experiencing, whatever we're doing, whatever's happening in the mind, the one common element that's always there is that we are conscious, we are aware. So I'm using consciousness in this general sense of an inner ability to be aware, to have experience. It's like it's the essence. It's the essence of any experience, is the fact that we are experiencing. So that's what I'm pointing towards more than how we are conscious. We could talk about somebody having a political consciousness or an environmental consciousness or a social consciousness. That's talking about how we are conscious. I'm more interested in the fact that we are conscious.
Mm.
So when I'm talking about consciousness, generally I'm pointing in that direction. Why is it that we have this inner awareness in the most general sense? And I don't think it's just human beings.
Sure.
I would say animals have it too. I mean, if you look at a dog, when a dog's sleeping, it appears to be dreaming, and we imagine it's having experiences. When we see its sort of paws twitching, we imagine it's dreaming of chasing a cat or something. And
but I guess also that when you're talking about consciousness, you're talking about more than just being awake and kind of responding to environment, right? You're talking more about actually making choices and things like that, right?
Yes, I think all of that is part of consciousness, the ability to make choice, the ability to respond, and being awake is one mode of consciousness, you could say. Being awake, being alert is one mode of consciousness. Dreaming when you're asleep is another way of being conscious. And we even know that people can have some experiences even when they're in a coma, when we would say they're completely unconscious. And yet, we know they can recall some experiences sometimes. So it's like the intensity of consciousness can get turned down, but it doesn't go out. A good analogy that's often used is like the light from a projector. When you watch a film or you're seeing, a slideshow, you see many pictures on the screen, and they're all created out of the light from the projector. The light inside the projector shines through the film, and you see an image. And what is always there, but we don't notice, is the light. The light is always shining. We could turn the light down, and the pictures will become dimmer. And I think it's the same with the mind. There's always this ability to be conscious. There's always awareness. We're not always aware of it. We don't always notice it, and it can be turned down very dim. But there's always something that's there. And it's that sense of being an experiencing person. That's another way to look at it.
So, where would you say that consciousness kind of comes from then? I think you had this interesting argument that consciousness kind of, it seems like cannot kind of arise from unconscious matter. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yes, this is the big question. This is the sort of $64,000 question or more that everybody is asking, and philosophers have been asking this question for hundreds of years. But it's really coming to a focus these days because we're becoming so much more knowledgeable about the brain and how the brain works. There's this question, where does consciousness come from? And the current scientific view, and it's almost not just the scientific view, but it's the view you find throughout our culture, and it's really just an assumption, is that somehow the activity in the brain creates awareness, it creates consciousness. Now, there's no doubt at all that what happens in the brain determines what we experience in our consciousness. And we know that if you stimulate a certain part of the brain, we have a certain experience. Take a certain part of the brain, if it's damaged, we lose a certain experience. So it's very clear, and we can monitor this with instruments. If you ask a person to solve a mathematical problem, you see a certain part of the brain sort of lighting up. So it's very clear that what we experience depends upon the brain. But then we make the assumption that experience itself, that consciousness, that mind is created by the brain. And that's where you end up with this problem. It's often called the hard problem in philosophy. It's how does unconscious matter, we assume that matter is not conscious, that the nerve cells in the brain don't have minds, they're not conscious, and yet somehow all this unconscious matter gives rise to something which is totally different. The mind is not matter. You can't measure mind, you can't weigh it, but it's clearly there. We experience it. How does that happen? And people have many, many different theories. Some believe it comes from quantum processes. Others think it's something to do with the biochemistry of the brain. Others think it's to do with information processing. But all the different explanations, they all come up against this one big problem, is how does something that has no consciousness, no awareness, ever give rise to the total opposite, something that is an experience, that is awareness.
Yeah.
And so the view I've been exploring is a totally different one, is to say that maybe consciousness is always there, that everything has an element of mind. I mean, I was saying a dog is conscious. We have no doubt about that a dog is an experiencing being. It may not think like we do, but it's having experiences. And you can go down and say, well, dog, maybe fish are, maybe insects are. Where do you draw the line? And the traditional view is, somewhere when a nervous system reaches a certain level of complexity, it creates consciousness. But I think we can go all the way and say consciousness is always there to some extent. But as living systems get more complex, so the amount of consciousness becomes much richer. So human consciousness, I would say, is probably the richest, most diverse consciousness on this planet. But everywhere there is some inner aspect, however ever faint. That is a very unconventional view, but it actually does solve this problem of how does the brain create consciousness, because it says consciousness was always there. The brain isn't creating consciousness, it's really amplifying consciousness.
So what you're saying is that the more a refined and developed nervous system, including the brain and all that stuff, the more advanced, so to speak, that is, the higher consciousness will kind of manifest within that system, right?
Yes. And so, we have a very exceedingly complex brain, which would also imply that things like whales and dolphins, which have even more complex brains,
yes,
may in some senses be even more conscious than we are.
When you ponder upon these questions, I mean, I don't know what your position is on that, but do you feel that consciousness is like one entity throughout the entire, either universe or multiverse, and this is like we're like a small droplet of this, of